I want to ask about some of these specifics of the role that China can play as a potential peacemaker when it comes to Moscow's war in and with Ukraine. Do you think Beijing sees itself as a possible guarantor for European security?
Definitely, Rebecca. Actually, I believe China can play three roles in this war. The first is one of the guarantors, along with other major powers, if the ceasefire is in place. Why is that? Because the Ukrainians deeply remember the pledges of the five nuclear powers when they decide to relinquish nuclear weapons. To some extent, of course, that kind of guarantee was not very much substantive in that all the five major powers could not provide a so-called positive guarantee. That is, if somebody beats you, then I will beat him. But this is what they remember. Given the volatility of the situation, I believe Ukraine will be afraid if there is no guarantee from major powers. Actually, this is what President Zelensky has been talking about. And on the other side, Russia also needs a kind of security guarantee. Why? Because Russia doesn't want to stand looking isolated, right? Because the whole West is behind Ukraine. The hook might be on Russia's side. China is not on Russia's side. But President Putin talked about how China, India, and Brazil, these countries from global south, can be honest brokers. This is the first thing. The second thing is a big if. If peacekeeping is needed, then of course China and other countries from global south are best positioned to play this role, because NATO countries, even if wearing the hat of EU countries, would not be trusted by Russia. Russia would simply take these countries as wolves in sheep's clothing, right? So otherwise, why would Russia have fought this war after all? It's because of NATO. The third thing is most obvious, given China's capability in infrastructure building that is next to none. China definitely can play a crucial role in post-war Ukraine, because China simply can do things more efficiently at lower cost.
It's interesting that you talk about this point about the potential for China to cooperate with countries from the global south and so on in terms of the potential sort of peacekeeping force when it comes to Europe. The other point here, of course, that's important is China has, the largest base of peacekeeping forces within the UN when we look at permanent UN security, the Security Commission there. But typically, China doesn't send troops in anywhere without authorization, and typically it hasn't played the role of this kind of security guarantor. So I wonder how you assess China's willingness to send peacekeeping forces into Ukraine.
Well, you see, for peacekeeping to happen, first of all, the warring parties have to have consent of the five permanent members of the UN Security Council. In this way, it is a bit different in that Russia, one of the warring parties, is a permanent member of UN Security Council itself. So if peacekeeping is needed and has to be authorized by UN, this has to be a special arrangement. But because of China's contribution to peacekeeping that can be seen by everybody, and so I think China simply is better positioned to play this role, and because it can be trusted, and it is impartial, because impartiality is one of the preconditions for peacekeeping. But the significance maybe is that for the first time, China will be seen in having a role in the security of Europe. That is something unprecedented, but China is invited.
Right. Now, my question takes a step back, Senior Colonel David here. You've been quick to emphasize that the role that China plays is post any ceasefire. Is there any role you think China can play that brings us closer to a ceasefire?
Well, I have some doubts about this. Yeah, that's a very good question, because right now Russia and the United States is having direct talks. So basically, I believe Ukraine should be invited to attend this talk. Otherwise, it look a bit like what Soviet and Germany did on the land of Poland, right? To have their own spheres of influence, because Ukraine is a country being invaded. So to let its destiny be divided by Russia and the United States, this is not so fair for Ukraine, I would say. But at this stage, I don't believe China can play a very big role. I believe China's role will come when they have negotiated something, but short of a guarantee. Then China can join other major powers in providing this kind of guarantee. And then China, of course, can do peacekeeping and post-war reconstruction. So China's role will come a little bit later.
There has been some discussion about the sort of so-called reverse Nixon possibility here, this idea that the US will move to split or at least create more distance between President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin. How concerned do you think Beijing is about that possible scenario?
That is totally impossible. Just imagine for a moment, okay, in post-Putin area, we don't know when that will be, right? So a new president will normally change some of the policies by his predecessors. But given that China and Russia are largest neighbor towards each other, so whoever comes into Kremlin would have to consider about this fact that we are the largest neighbor toward each other. Therefore, we must have an amicable relationship. And I believe Russia's best chance of tilting toward the West was after its dissolution of the Soviet Union. Even Putin would want to join NATO. But if at that time that kind of dream was doomed, and given how good the relationship between China and Russia is, so I don't believe that even in the post-Putin area, this relationship will change a lot. And during President Putin's area, of course, I believe this relationship will simply continue.
Right. Can I just get your thoughts as well on, I mean, this takes us directly into Chinese-American relations, and we're trying to figure out where the rationale is amidst all the noise. And from your perspective in Beijing, has President Trump acted in a way that we were expecting him to act?
I think, well, this is sheer speculation, which I hope is not hallucination. I think it might be possible because after seeing how he has, acted in a different way against China. So I think there is a possibility that actually during his second term, China and American relationship might improve, contrary to most people's speculation. Because his legacy during his first term actually is a kind of a bipartisan, consensus against China. I don't mean he wants that himself, but he has largely, left it to some China hawks like Peter Navarro and Secretary of State Pompeo to hijack this relationship. So who is the best position to change his own legacy? Of course, he himself, right? His attitude toward China so far has been friendly. So this gives me some hope. We'll see.
We also, nonetheless, still have seen this sort of flurry of actions taken by the Trump administration over the weekend, not least the shift on CFIUS, the change on U.S. investment, the pressure on Mexico to introduce its own tariffs on China. Do you think that all of these components of different pieces of news that we've had over the weekend, is this a step change in the response of the Trump administration towards Beijing?
As I said, we'll have to wait and see. But what is interesting for me is actually that his tariff on China is lower than the tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which is 25%, right? He only had 10% on China, and China, swiftly retaliated with even 15% tariff on some selected American items. So because he talked about 60%, just imagine, when he was at election. So this turned out to be much, much more, milder than expected. So that gives me a lot of speculations. I don't know where the future will go, but there is a hope that he could be different from his first term, and he could even be different from his predecessor. Actually, Joe Biden was quite friendly towards China. He was even called Beijing's Joe. But apparently he could not walk out of the trap laid down by those China hawks. So he even doubled down, on the road of competition with China to have this kind of a so-called small yard high fence on and so forth. So we have some hope.
Do you think there's a chance we'll get a meeting between Xi Jinping and, dare I say, Beijing's Donald, just to use that analogy you just mentioned there?
Well, yeah, anything could happen because for China, this kind of direct talk among top leaders would be most, useful and significant. I'm aware of the of the remarks by Russian ambassador in China. He talked about how President, Xi has accepted Russia's invitation to go to Moscow to attend the commemorations of Soviet victory over Nazi. The Chinese media did not confirm that, but normally on such kind of things, Chinese media would only make an announcement a few days before such kind of things. But it's interesting, the Russian ambassador has mentioned it. The question is, $1 million question is, I believe Russia has also invited President Trump. So would Trump go there? If that happens, that would be really, really interesting.
There is a question in Washington, D.C. that some have been asking about whether or not a potential deal between Trump and Putin effectively gives President Xi a green light to invade Taiwan. Has anything really changed on Taiwan? Would any kind of deal between Trump and Putin change how Beijing thinks about Taiwan?
No, I don't think so, because people have been talking how Ukraine today will be Taiwan's tomorrow. But I think this is really, really a big issue. If you observe, you would find that the Chinese government is still talking about peaceful reunification, right? So yes, the fact is two leaders of Taiwan are DPP. But still, we're talking about the peaceful reunification. That means we still have lost the confidence. And why should we lose confidence? Because Taiwan would not move away. The strength of mainland is growing, both economically and militarily. So time is on our side. There's no such a hurry. We have never announced a timetable. That is most important. We have never announced a timetable for peaceful reunification. So I believe we are still confident. A big question for China is, would the growth of strength of China make China more confident about peaceful reunification, or would it make mainland China more impatient to resort to use of force? I believe the answer is the first part. We're still having confidence.